He signed it himself, omitting the part that we had passed.
He committed fraud.
Forgery.
Forgery, I'm sorry, yes.
And maybe election fraud. I mean, I don't know how you...
Yeah.
None of the establishment candidates would get tickets. Mm-hmm. I had people coming from 3 states around to come hear Ron Paul in Cedar City.
Yeah.
And I couldn't get... I shouldn't name names. I couldn't get our local state senators, state congressmen, mayor, city council people.
They didn't want to be involved with Ron Paul.
They did not want to come to a Ron Paul event because that was not their flavor of Republicanism.
So he refused to enforce the party rules so that he could break them and become governor.
That's exactly that.
That's exactly how corrupt your current governor of the state of Utah is.
Yep. Yes, we are recording.
Okay. What do we want to talk about?
Well, so here's what I'm thinking. I think I've got a story. And I think your insight into my storytelling could be entertaining. And my story is a
This
story...
going to be a story I've heard before?
Most of it. A story with a prequel and a sequel.
Let's do it.
So you know how like in Swordfish, the movie, they have like this...
Uh-huh.
They have this opening scene where like there's this really dramatic, really violent and horrific explosion.
Yeah.
And then you're like, what is going on?
Yeah, what led to that?
And then it says something like
3 days
3 days earlier, and you have some weird Italian-looking dude carrying a leather briefcase through an airport, right?
Yeah.
Incidentally, as a segue, or not a segue, what do you call it when you're just on a tangent? So, when the movie theater or the movie studio that did the latest Atlas Shrugged, when they bought the movie rights, I thought I was rich. You remember, I've told you stories about when I thought I was rich. I was an idiot.
Yeah.
I was able to send out a whole bunch of emails to every email address associated with that movie theater company, and I said, hey, look, I have a lot of rich friends. We're all about Atlas Shrugged. We would love to help you make this a smash, like a hit. And I'm a movie lover. Like I'm all about movies. Yeah. Aficionado, would that be a good word for somebody that loves movies? I was like, let me pitch this idea to you. The plane chasing scene could be your opening sequence. And then you could be like 3 years earlier. And you could show the transition of all of these heroes leaving society.
Yeah. And
then I went broke. You know, like it was... And so
that happens.
So I had sent it from my corporate domain.
Oh.
Which I no longer owned. And somebody else snagged it up thinking that they could ransom it to me. You know, like that's a total thing out there in the world.
Yeah.
When a domain is used by a corporation and they don't renew it in time, buy it really quick, list it for $30,000. It costs you $20. They'll buy it for $30,000 because they have a business. Well, my business was defunct, so it didn't matter. But then I couldn't get correspondence. It turns out I had a ton of other, like a bunch of my accounts, like social media and stuff were
all
linked to
emailed to that.
And it was a problem, but not $30,000 of a problem. Anyway, so here's the interesting thing. I went to Atlas Shrugged in the theater, the first one, loved it.
Yeah. And
then I went to Atlas Shrugged Part 2, and they opened the movie with the flight scene. And I was like, that was my idea! And, you know, they couldn't credit, I've looked at the credits, but I didn't watch the credits very well. Maybe they credited some random idiot that sent us an email.
Look at the Reddit. Credit for random idiot. Got
to
it.
be rich enough to help us finance the movie and then ghosted us when we actually tried to put it together. So we ended up having to switch actors every time.
Is that why it was you?
I think it's possible. I mean, maybe I'm just arrogant and I think that everything's about me, and that's maybe. I don't know. Anyway, so
was any of that part of the story that you're about to tell me, or is that just telling you about prequels and
sequels? It's an antic.
Okay, so your story is not about that. What is your story?
I'm full of antics. So here's the story that I have. The story is Monday. I drove to Salt Lake City and I registered to run for Congress in the 2023 special election to replace Chris Stewart.
Woohoo!
Do we do the...
Whatever.
I thought it was like a wrist bump almost is the strategy or the whatever. We're old. We don't get this.
Still in my 40s.
Yeah,
And I'm older than you.
we're old. Look at the salt and pepper in your beard. You're more salt than pepper.
I am. I don't know. I have 9 kids.
Although
they suck the color right
Although
out
the
of you.
reason I'm on this side of the table is because I'm
Yeah.
more salt than pepper right here. Anyway, so that's the story. And it was an interesting, just as a fun antic for that story, I took with me a bunch of gold bags, which we talked about on our last two podcasts ago.
Yeah.
And you had been talking with Evan Vickers about the law, the gold is a legal tender law that we were understood but haven't read ourselves.
Yeah.
That the state supposedly passed that allowed people to pay for fees and taxes and things in gold. And you were trying to get it passed in Enoch City, and it failed because nobody had any kind of vision.
Because the state treasurer's office, not the treasurer, but his office, said, well, you'll have to come up with some kind of system on how to, cash those in, monetize them, turn them into dollars. And they didn't have one themselves. And so my counsel's like, well, we're not going to reinvent the wheel.
Remind me to text you Marlo's number
Yes,
before
please.
you go.
Okay.
Anyway, so I took gold bags to the state capitol, and I took $2,000 worth of gold bags, just in case.
Yeah.
One, to show off, to try and persuade, and number two, I figured they wouldn't accept them at market value. They would probably only accept them at spot value.
For the golden.
Which means I'd be paying double almost for them.
Yeah.
Anyway, so I got to the lieutenant governor's office and it's locked. Apparently, and I think it was partially a result of COVID and partially a result of angry citizens walking around the Capitol with long arms.
Uh-huh.
All of the executive offices at the Capitol building are locked, and they have like a ring doorbell essentially outside of every office. And then it says, make an appointment. Here's a QR code. You can make an appointment. And then when you're ringing the doorbell, you say, this is Brad Green, and I have an appointment. And they're like, oh, yes, Mr. Green, come on in. And then they buzz you in to a room where they have 1 inch thick, bulletproof glass reception area.
Way to make your citizens feel welcome.
Yeah, it was weird. But I didn't have an appointment, and I wasn't about to make one. I figured that
Yeah, you were just filling out a form.
the fact that I'm filling out a form and running for Congress would be good enough, and it was, but I had to wait about 15 minutes. I rang the doorbell thing, and they said, what's up? And I said, I'm running for office. And they said, okay, please wait. And then they were like, all the offices, like the registration period has ended. And I said, not this one. And they said, oh, the Congress.
Yeah, they knew which one was open.
Yeah. So anyway, we did that, and as I was ushered into a conference room to fill out my paperwork, I said, look, while I'm filling out the paperwork, I brought gold bags to pay in gold because my understanding from conversations a city councilman in my county has been having with Senator Vickers, who I think is the majority whip of the Senate, you guys should be able to accept gold for payment. So while I'm filling out paperwork, why don't you
Figure out how to do that.
correspond with Lieutenant Governor Deidre Henderson or whoever else you've got to make this a reality? She's like, really? And I explained, and I showed her my gold, and she's like, that's so cool, but I don't know, nobody's ever asked for that before.
Yeah.
So she's texting and calling, and I'm filling out paperwork, right? So it takes me, and it only takes me like 5 minutes to fill out the paperwork, and she has to read to me a bunch of stuff that's required. And so she read to me the stuff, and I signed the thing that said that. And she's like, okay, now come in here and we'll get this registered, and then we'll see what we can figure out about the payment. So I go in there, she disappears for like 20 minutes. And I can hear her like office to office talking to people. In the meantime, I'm like, this might be a problem. And I'm thinking, what am I going to do if she comes back and says, we don't know what to do, or you can't do that? I'm a salesman. Have you seen Tommy Boy?
Yeah.
Where he's like going to get his chicken nuggets. It's like, what are they going to do? Say no? Like you've already got no. So nothing is worse than what you currently got. You might as well try something.
Yeah.
So I'm getting ready to put on my salesman show, and they come back and they're like, we just don't know how to even verify that it's gold, that it has any value whatsoever.
Right.
We don't even know what to do.
Okay.
And I was like, well, if I could get somebody here, like somebody that's smart, I'm thinking that. I'm like, how do you describe somebody that actually has objective judgment in themselves and not just that teachers didn't teach them how to figure things out?
Yeah.
But if I could get somebody here, like, I don't know, the treasurer, the auditor, I mean,
get Dougal
and
or Marlo
I can
down
text
there
these guys. We're text friends, we can figure this out. And they're like, if you could get the treasurer to tell us what to do, that would be fine. really, even if the auditor could tell us. And so I text John Dougal, I text Evan Vickers, and I text Marlo Oakes. Marlo's...
Those who don't know, Evan Vickers is a state senator. He's in state leadership.
Yeah.
Marlo Oakes is the state treasurer for the state of Utah, and Dougal is the state auditor.
Correct. So all three of them use iPhones and have iMessage enabled with return receipts.
Yeah.
Same as I do, and for some reason you don't have iMessage enabled. So I never know that my messages get through to you until you respond. So immediately Dougal's got delivered, Vickers got delivered, Marlo Oakes didn't. And I'm like, okay, well, he's out of coverage or his phone's off or dead. This is not going to be great. Dougal immediately calls me back. And he's driving. He's like, all right, Brad. So that's really not my department. That's treasurer. I'm like, well, I text Marlo, but he hasn't really got the message yet. And he's like, well, let me call his office. So he hangs up. 5 minutes later, he calls me back and says, well, I talked to the lieutenant deputy, I don't remember the guy's name, in the office, and he doesn't know what to do. He's trying to figure it out. He's trying to get hold of Marlo. Well, Marlo hasn't responded. Then Vickers gets back to me, and he's like, I know we worked on a bill like that. I remember it, and it was supposed to be able to pay taxes. He's like,
yeah, I talked to him about it a week and a half ago. He's like, our intention was to let people pay for this type of stuff with fees, so let's figure out why.
Anyway, so Dougal can't figure it out, so I go down to the treasurer's office to try and talk to whoever Dougal was talking to. And he's not there. He's at a convention. Like, Dougal's been talking to him on the phone, and he's not at the office. Like, none of these guys that are elected are at the Capitol building. I mean, it was a Monday afternoon, right?
Yeah.
I mean, if Friday afternoon, maybe I understand, but Monday afternoon at 3 o'clock, I would expect
them there.
I can find all of my executives in one of my offices anywhere in the company on Monday at 3 p.m. Unless they're on vacation that they've given lots of notice for.
Yeah, that's standard work hour. Yeah.
Anyway, that was frustrating. The treasurer, the people down there, they have these two massive safes that are just propped open. Nobody guarding them. They're just, I think they're for show. Maybe at night they put the checks and things in there and lock them up. I don't know.
Yeah.
But they're like, that's cool. Don't have the authority. Nobody's here with the authority. Have you tried getting a hold of Marlo, like emailing him? And I was like, I'm texting him. So he texts me back about then and says something like, no one has ever asked for that ever before. And I'm like, okay, I understand. The people upstairs in Deidre Henderson's office would rather I sign my signature on a piece of paper than give them gold.
Just ridiculous.
I'm asking you if you would rather take gold from me than an IOU.
If you don't understand why that's ridiculous, go watch our episode on goldbacks. They'd rather have an IOU, a check, a piece of paper with your signature than gold.
Right. So
anyway,
he's like, let me call. And it sounded to me like he was calling, like, I'm sure it was a bank of some kind. But it sounded to me like he was calling like a building contractor, like it was some kind of something building. It was probably a finance building or something, but the way he described it was like, I was like, you're going to call? You're the state treasurer. Like, who are you going to call?
Yeah, you're the one in charge, man.
So Dougal calls me back and is like, hey, the other guy from the treasurer's office says they don't really have any protocol for it. They think that the legislature needs to give them that, which probably needs to be written by their office and submitted to the legislature and then approved. So he doesn't think they can do it. And I'm like, as a state auditor, he's like, I don't have any authority in that regard. Marlo comes back and he's like, they don't know how to do it. They don't even know what it is. I've never even heard of it. I'm like, you haven't heard of this? Like,
what? Okay.
So,
okay.
So then Evan Vickers gets back to me. He was like, I think that bill was actually crypto as a legal tender.
Well, what about the bill that legalized? There was gold and silver one.
There was totally a gold and silver one. And Vickers maybe wasn't there for that, or maybe that's all he could get on short notice. I realize I put him on the spot.
Yeah, that's hard.
That sucks, and that's my bad.
And that's not his department, so that's fine.
Right. Yeah. So I couldn't pay with gold. I paid with an IOU that my bank has to honor. Yeah.
Yes.
And there's plenty of money in there, although I had significantly more value in gold in my hand than that bank account has ever had.
Yeah.
And anyway, I registered. I'm running for Congress.
Sweet.
So that's the story. So the prequel is this. You ready for the prequel?
We're now ready for the prequel?
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
All right. You know this. You know the prequel.
Okay.
In 2017, I ran for secretary of the Iron County Republican Party.
Mm-hmm.
And I was beat by a attractive, prepared young lady. She had the bylaws and the county constitution, and anytime anybody had a question, she had it. She was ready with it.
Right.
And she was nominated by a current politician. I think it was John Westwood at the time. I think it might have been his daughter-in-law. I don't know the specifics there, but he nominated her. He was well liked. She was attractive and prepared. And then there's me. I wasn't as prepared. I'm ugly. I was nominated by myself. And my business partner, Ryan Nilsson, was running the meeting as the chairman of the party. And he thought that I was too new to the county and hadn't changed my registration yet.
Oh.
And he thought, see, because the caucus meeting happened like 2 weeks before that, and I had just moved to town. And he was like, Brad, only delegates can nominate someone.
Oh.
And I was like, Ryan, I'm a delegate, state and county, elected from precinct 20.
Yeah.
And he was like, you're new here. Like, he had been my boss when I lived up in Springville.
Right.
And so he was like, there's no way you were that proactive. And I'm like, hello, Brad Green. You know? So it was a little embarrassing for me to have somebody that should know.
Yeah, well, question you in front of everybody.
Question me in front of everybody. And then you have somebody that everybody knows and likes and respects nominating somebody that appeared. Anyway, so it prejudiced.
You lost.
It prejudiced the election. I lost. And I had put a lot into it thinking that it was going to be easy. It was going to be a cakewalk, but that I wasn't going to half-ass it.
Yeah.
And I didn't. But I lost anyway, and I was like, well, that was dumb. And then a month later, the executive team, the chairman, vice chair, and treasurer, at the time I think was Blake Cousins, Casey Anderson, and Richard Genk.
Mm-hmm.
No, it wasn't Richard Genk. Who was the treasurer? Doesn't matter. So the executive team of the Republican Party called me, and they said, hey, do you still want to be secretary? And I was like,
a month?
Yeah, a month later. And I was like, I guess. I mean, why? What happened? And they said, well, she resigned. I said, why did she resign? I said, well, she didn't come to that meeting wanting to be secretary. It was just kind of like the spur of a moment thing. And when she got into secretary, she found out that the secretary, the primary responsibility for our largest fundraiser, really our only fundraiser, the Lincoln Day Dinner, is the secretary's responsibility. The caucus night, the conventions, the chairman and vice chair hold those, they handle those, and then the treasurer handles the money. The secretary puts together our fundraiser and the logistics.
Right.
And she don't want to do that. She's not a party planner. She's not a logistics person.
She doesn't want to play, so she quit.
So she quit. Do you want the job? You were the runner-up. You were second place.
Yep.
And I'm like, sure. I mean, I was willing to do it before. I don't get the glory that I would have got from winning a contest, but I'll do the job. So then, like, okay, well, who should we get? We normally make about $4,000, and as long as we spend less than $3,000 putting it together, that's a win, and we can spend that $1,000 sending out notices for next year's conventions, and we don't really have to support any candidates because you can't win in this county if you're not a Republican, and we can't support or endorse or spend money on a candidate until after the primary.
And so there's no need to spend any money.
And so there's no need for us to spend money on candidates because there's never a legitimate Democrat or Libertarian running against us in the county. And so the only thing we do with our money in the county is throw the Lincoln Day Dinner and send out notifications to conventions and caucus nights.
Yeah.
That's all they do with the money. And so $1,000 a year extra over, the Lincoln Day Dinner has to pay for itself. So they have that $3,000 reserve. And then they have to make an extra $1,000 to do all the notifications and stuff. And I said, okay, but like, that's the goal? I mean,
$1,000 profit, is it?
Like, how much time am I expected to put into the county making $1,000?
Yeah.
Like,
if I'm going to put in the time, I want to make 10 times that or more.
Yeah. Right? And I mean, shocking. I mean, like every day I had to generate $1,000 worth of profit for my company or else I was like draining it.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And I was just like shocked. And they were like, well, I mean, what do you have in mind? I'm like, well, get a big name. Have like some really cool something that everybody wants to show up. And then charge more for the ticket. And they're like, well, we normally get like $20 a ticket and it's $10 for the food. And,
Yeah.
I'm like, okay, but like who could we get that would draw $100 a plate? And they're like, this is Iron County. Nobody has that kind of money.
You bring in the right person, the money shows up.
And so I was like, I mean, think of a big person, like, yeah, like who? Like Ben Shapiro? And I was like, well, I don't really like Ben Shapiro that much because his voice annoys me. But Yeah, you could probably get $100 a plate for Ben Shapiro. Jordan Peterson, I didn't know at the time, but you could easily get $100 a plate for Jordan Peterson.
Yeah.
I was like, what about Ron Paul? And they're like, how are you going to get Ron Paul to come to Cedar? And I said, well, Connor Boyack knows him and we're friends. And they're like, it takes more than that, Brad. And I was like, sure, but you got to start somewhere. I mean,
Yeah.
the future is for the dreamers, you know. It
Yep.
belongs to the dreamers. So they said, well, if you can get Ron Paul, go for it. But, you know, you ought to maybe have a backup plan. And I was like, all right, well, I'll be thinking about a backup plan. So I find out, I get a hold of Ron Paul's guy, and he's like, well, you have to do those kinds of things through the agency. And the agency's like, okay, he needs a jet, something that can get him from the regional airport closest to his house directly into your airport without stopping for fuel along the way. And because that flight might be more than 2 hours, it needs to have a bathroom. Those are the conditions of transportation. I'm like, well, we can't just send him first class tickets.
Mm-hmm.
They're like, he's not driving to Houston, and he's certainly not driving from Vegas or Salt Lake.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a long drive.
So I find a friend who's willing to donate
The use of his jet.
the use of a turboprop with a bathroom.
Yeah.
It's a
Still
Pilatus,
private,
Pilatus
so yeah.
PC-12. And he says, oh no, the dinner won't get over until like 10 o'clock, which is like 11 o'clock Texas time, like the event.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm an old man. Well, this is his agent.
Yes.
He's an old man. He can't do that. And I'm like, well, yeah, but he's pretty spry. And they're like, still, he's like 82 years old.
Yeah.
And so they're like, it'll take 6 hours for that turboprop to get from Cedar City back to Lake Jackson, Texas. And that's going to be 4 a.m. I'm like, well, I can put him up at any hotel in the area. We have some really nice ones. And they're like, no, he's not doing an overnighter. He's got to be home that night. And I was like, work with me. And they're like, you need a jet. I can give you the names of the jet companies we previously used. And they wanted $45,000 to fly
Oh,
him
jeez.
to and from with repositioning and fuel and airport fees. So I'm like, okay, well, maybe. And then I find out that he's $50,000 to
For a speaking fee.
speaking fee. We're doing it at college. I'm a young guy. I'm going to get a whole bunch of young people there. I talk him down a little bit on the speaking fee. And then I find a local company that owns Cyberjet, and they let us use their corporate jet.
Nice.
So we brought the jet costs down to about 24 grand. And I got his speaking fee down to an undisclosed amount. And in the end, we net about 20 grand on the event.
Sweet.
And that was cool, right?
Yeah.
So that's the prequel that was exciting for me.
Yeah, you brought Ron Paul to Iron County, Utah, raised a ton
And the funny
more
thing is,
money
when I
than they
announced
ever
it
had.
was Ron Paul, none of the establishment candidates would get tickets.
Mm-hmm.
I had people coming from 3 states around to come hear Ron Paul in Cedar City.
Yeah.
And I couldn't get, I shouldn't name names, I couldn't get our local state senators, state congressmen, mayor, city council people.
They didn't want to be involved with Ron Paul.
They did not want to come to a Ron Paul event because that was not their flavor of republicanism.
Mm.
And then my phone rings one day, and for some, I don't normally answer my phone if I don't know the number.
Yeah.
It was Mitt Romney. He calls me and says, Brad, I don't know if you knew this, but Ron Paul and I are friends, and I want to come to your dinner. He was running for Senate.
Yeah.
It's just another campaign stop for him.
Yeah.
Turns out him and Ron Paul are friends. Ron Paul validated that. Apparently everybody hated them on the presidential campaign trail.
Yeah.
And so the
They hated
two
the
of them were
Mormon,
friends.
hated the Libertarian, and so they got to be friends
They
with each
were
other.
friends,
'cause-
despite being kind of opposite ends of the
Yeah.
Republican spectrum. And
Yeah.
so Mitt Romney says, well, I'm coming. I sold him our most expensive table. I had reserved, I was the first one to put a bunch of money into the event from my company. That's part of the reason why I made a bunch of money. I got 2 tables.
Yeah.
I sold one table really expensively with a sponsorship to the KMV crowd. And then I had Mitt Romney. And those were the 4 front tables.
Yeah.
And as soon as Mitt Romney confirmed, I got phone calls from our state senator, our state house representative, 3 mayors.
Now they all wanted to be there.
The councilmen all booked on Senator Vickers' table.
Mm.
Like they were like, we don't want to give them too much money, but
Just
we want to
named
be
him
there.
senator, but that's
That's
fine.
okay. And so they kind of stingied their way into it, but they were there.
Yeah.
And it was interesting because I sold probably 20 tables. I thought I was done selling tables, and I thought I had maybe 40 tables left, and I think I sold 20 tables within a day of Mitt Romney confirming.
Wow.
So there's some personality politics.
Yeah.
So following that, what I consider to be a great success, one of our city councilmen in the area decided he was going to run for county commission. and there was a lot of controversy around it. And his campaign was taking more of his energy than he had, and he was also a member of the State Central Committee. So he resigned from the State Central Committee job. And the executive committee came to me again and said, hey, we think we have another secretary that can do the job now that Lincoln Day dinner is done. We'll give Richard Genk the secretary position, and we will nominate you for the County Central Committee to the State Central.
Yeah, you raised a ton of money, you have some pull.
Yep. So in late fall 2017, I became a member of the Republican Party State Central Committee.
Yeah.
And I did not know that there was so much to know about a political party. Because the State Central Committee is the legislative body, it's the governing body of the party. Essentially, Republicanism is that neighborhoods get together and they pick the person they trust their values of, or they expect them to be able to carry those values well, they're effective.
Yeah.
And they send them to a delegation, and then that delegation selects their representative, and they go to a delegation. And so the neighborhood caucus meetings, they nominate their neighbors to be delegates.
Mm-hmm.
They go to the county convention, sometimes the state convention, and they nominate the representatives for the county or the district or the state.
Yep.
And so the State Central Committee represents the precincts and the counties at the state level, governing the party so that it maintains its good reputation.
Right.
Well, when I got the State Central Committee, I think it was my first meeting, was the one where we started hearing about the Gang of 51. Do you remember?
Yep.
Did you ever hear in the news about the Gang of 51?
I did.
So I showed up and they had lawyers. Like, everybody had a lawyer. Like, all sides of this argument had their own lawyers. And it was funny because as I was talking to one of the lawyers that I knew from my own personal experience before the meeting, he says, well, here's the thing. If you ask two lawyers their opinion, you'll get three opinions.
Yeah.
And that's how the meeting transpired. So the friend that I was talking to that was a lawyer, he was actually retained by the party. That's Marcus Mumford, wonderful lawyer. And but the chairman of the party disagreed with him. And so he had hired his own counsel and wouldn't, he claimed he had spent his own money on it, although he deleted all the records when he left office. So we can't prove that. Allegedly. And again, that's something else the Republicans don't know. This kind of nonsense went on behind the scenes.
No kidding.
So they have this argument, and Marcus Mumford says, okay, what has happened is the state legislature has taken over our nominating powers. They have told us that as a party, we can only freely associate and pick our nominee if we do it their way. And he's like, I considered that like if the legislature, the state senate, would tell the LDS church, this is the path you have to follow to pick the next prophet or president of the church.
Yeah.
You know, right now, generally it's the oldest member of the first presidency or the 12 apostles, right? They could be like, no, it has
Not
to be
the oldest, the longest serving.
is the longest, but they could say it has to be the oldest, or they could say it's the one that has the longest beard or the shortest beard.
Right, yeah, so the state could come in and say, rather than the longest serving apostle, you could do that, but anyone who gathers enough signatures can have a vote on...
So they did. They
Yes.
did signature. And the interesting thing is I've talked to the people that passed
No, I'm saying that's what they could tell the church they had to do.
They could. That's what they told the party they would do. I've talked to the people that passed the legislation that said, look, it was a compromise. There was a group out there that was well-funded, primarily of Democrats and the Levitts and other moneyed people, that were going to pay a bunch of money to eliminate the convention system. And they were going to send it to a jungle primary where everybody could get on the ballot regardless of party affiliation, and they could be nominated by the Republican Party, including Bernie Sanders. At the time in court, they argued Bernie Sanders could come and run as a Democrat on the Republican primary ballot.
Yep.
And interestingly, they said that's what they were trying to stop by passing SB 54 in 2014.
That's exactly that.
But guess what? That was actually part of the bill. It said it was a jungle primary. That was the first thing the court threw out. Did you know that the court actually had to throw out? No, you have to be registered a Republican to run in the Republican Party primary.
Yeah.
So that did get thrown out. The legislatures don't want to talk about that because they lost that. The Republicans don't want to talk about it because Marcus Mumford never filed to make the state pay for legal damages.
Oh, yeah?
And so the Republican Party almost went bankrupt trying to fight the next part of the battle because they hadn't recouped the costs of the first part that they'd won. I think because they didn't think they'd win. Paul Cousins actually hates, maybe not hates, but he was not a fan of Marcus Mumford as a result of that. Anyway, so I'm at this meeting, and what happened was there was a group that got labeled the Gang of 51. They had this executive meeting where you're not supposed to talk about things, although there's a guy named Peter Whitehouse, I think, was alleged to have turned the camera back on after everybody had cleared the room and they were checking the doors. He had record again on the camera. It looks like that from the footage that got leaked from that meeting. He comes over, it starts, it turns off, and then when it turns back on, he's walking away from the camera. Anyway, again, that's just an allegation I can't prove, but the meeting was leaked. And what happened in the meeting was that the chairman said, you can't pass this change to the bylaws because it's illegal. And the people proposing the change said, we're the governing body of the party. We can pass anything we want, even if it is illegal. It isn't deemed illegal in actuality until a trier of fact has made it so.
Yes.
And he's saying, as the chairman of the party, I can't allow you to break the law. And they're like, we don't think it is breaking the law. We have 2 attorneys here that say that it isn't. And he's like, well, I have an attorney here that say that it is illegal. And we're like, okay, well, we need a judge. We need to try. We have conflict. Conflicts happen all the time. They need to be resolved by a trier of fact.
Yeah.
Until then, you're innocent until proven guilty.
Yeah.
And that was the argument of the State Central Committee. So we overrode the chairman's protests. In fact, I think we had to appeal the ruling of the chair and actually make him sit down. And the vice chair had already resigned because it was all contentious.
Yeah.
And so I think that the secretary was to conflict of interest because she was one of the sponsors.
Oh.
And so the treasurer refused to handle the meeting, so we had to elect a chair pro tem temporarily to handle the vote. And we voted, 51 of us apparently voted to approve an amendment to bylaw 8.1, which was you have to sign a contract that says you agree with the party's platform except for what you say otherwise, and you will, be honest in your dealings. Like candidate contracts are common.
Yeah.
That part still exists. They added teeth to it. They said if you gather signatures, actually, the gathering signatures was already added. Like, you're not allowed to gather signatures, but there was no enforcement mechanism, and so people were doing it. They said, if you violate this contract, you forfeit your party membership. That was the amendment. That was it.
Right.
This is a contract.
Yeah.
It's an enforcement mechanism. You're out of the party
if you
break the contract.
Yeah.
And part of the contract was don't collect signatures. So it was an emergency meeting called as a result of timing with the lawsuit. And so there was some 90 people there, which they claimed was like a really small meeting. But I went to a couple dozen of them, and that was a pretty good turnout in reality. So, but 51 people out of 89, I think it was, voted for it. It was like 74% or so. It was way more than it needed to be to pass a bylaw change.
Yeah.
And it passed. And the chairman refused to send it to the state. It was signed by the rules.
Who was the chairman at the time?
A guy named Rob Anderson. There's
Yeah.
lots of Rob Andersons, and so he's a Southwest Airlines pilot.
Okay.
Anyway, he wouldn't send it to the state election office. So the secretary, who realistically is the paper keeper, she sent it to the election office, and they refused it. At the time, the lieutenant governor and the head of the election office was a guy named Cox.
Yep. Spencer Cox.
And he refused to accept the version sent by the secretary that was signed by the rules committee and the vice chair that had just recently, the vice chair didn't get elected till later. The treasurer, I think, signed it.
Yeah.
And the rules committee, but the chairman wouldn't sign it. Spencer Cox said, no, the chairman has to sign this. And she's like, nowhere in our bylaws does it say that. And the state knows what to accept from our party based upon the bylaws that we've given you in advance. It says a member of the executive committee has to send any bylaw changes to the election office within a month.
And you had one.
And we had one. He wouldn't accept it. So this was like December 10th or something. So we got through Christmas, and the lawsuit was able to continue because they just operated as if the lawyers just operated in accordance with what that legislative body of the party had said, even though the chairman wouldn't get behind it.
Yeah.
And he wasn't paying the lawyer bills. He was claiming they didn't have money, which was partially true because Governor Herbert at the time told donors, don't give money to the Republican Party. They're using it to fight me. Give it to my own
campaign.
Elephant Club, or I don't remember what his campaign was called. So it gets through the holidays, and we have another regularly scheduled SCC meeting. And the issue comes up, and first of all, there's a bunch of people that say we need to repeal this amendment. And we have the vote, and it's just destroyed. I mean, the vote is worse than the original vote to pass it.
Right, so more people voted to keep the teeth than to get rid of it.
So then there was a vote, like it was like, okay, the chairman's like, well, I can't break the law, so I can't send this to the state. And we're like, we've already sent it to the state. He's like, they can't accept it from you guys. And we're like, where is that? That's a violation of state law itself. And he's like, that needs a trier of fact. And we're like, seriously? You're gaslighting us? Anyway, and so the party votes Mr. Chairman, you are now required, the SEC votes, you are compelled to send this to the state. Sign it and send it to the state because it's truthful what passed.
Yes.
And he refused, and we appealed the refusal and passed that he had to do it. But there was no teeth attached to having to do it.
Yeah.
'Cause what do? You impeach him, right? But that looks contentious to the Utahns that aren't paying attention. And all this happens in executive meetings because we want to look like everything's happening.
We're functioning even though it's
the negativity is hurtful to an organization. So, but they keep getting leaked. Somebody's recording them and leaking them in with their own narrative, and they're cutting out the pieces that they don't like and the arguments and the angles. Anyway, so the next meeting they start putting teeth on it, and I think that was the Tooele. Nope, that was the one right before the Tooele meeting. The Tooele meeting got crazy. The chairman finally agreed. Okay, whatever you do whatever you want to do, and I'll do what I have to. So he took the document. Now I haven't seen this myself. It was alleged and generally accepted as truthful in the SEC, including by him and his wife, who argued that he had to do it to not violate the law. That he took the bylaws as had been amended, and he cut out the part he didn't like with like a PDF editor. But he kept the rules committee, the secretary, treasurer signatures. He signed it himself, omitting the part that we had passed.
He committed fraud.
Forgery,
I'm sorry, yes.
and maybe election fraud. I mean, I don't know how you.
Yeah.
Anyway, he submitted that to the lieutenant governor's office, who promptly accepted it.
Of course.
And filed it.
Because that would be Spencer Cox. And it
This
worked in his
happened
favor.
in Utah in 2018.
Yes.
Right before Spencer Cox announces his campaign for governor.
Yes. At which he gathered signatures in order to get on the primary.
In Tooele, this was exposed, and to avoid it from becoming a criminal proceeding, which I would have preferred, they again did it in executive committee. They sanctioned the chair, required that he put the actual voted on version on the website, that he post an apology of the secretary who he had slandered on the website and on his social media page, which he, I think, refused to do. If he was not to do that, we would impeach him at the next meeting.
Yeah.
Before the next meeting, he announced he wasn't running again, and it was the last meeting before the
Yeah.
midterm.
So don't impeach him, just let him
He
go.
was out, and everybody went into the next convention thinking that guy was great, thinking that there wasn't this turmoil. The delegates were not aware of it, and the problem was my side of the table knew that it was being leaked, and so it was out there public. It had already, that seal had been broken. I'm trying to remember, lawyers call it waiving privilege, essentially. But we had committed not to disclose what was done in that meeting. Now, I don't know what the teeth would be. I think they'd kick us out of the party.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Like,
yeah,
I
they
think
kick you out for that, but not him for yes.
So I can't, nobody on the side that was saying, look, we need to have teeth to enforce on politicians to not
break our
use the
rules.
state law to break our rules. And so our side wasn't out there giving the narrative in the media because we didn't want to be sued for violating, because we thought that they would actually, and they probably would have actually sued us, personally tried to hold us liable despite having never signed non-disclosures and things like that. I think realistically the law probably eventually would have had to say all they could do is expel you from the ranks, but it would have cost you a lot of money to get to that point because motion practice is expensive.
Yeah.
Anyway, somebody did throw rocks at Rob Anderson's car after the Tooele meeting. Now, I think it might have been him, but he swears up and down that somebody vandalized his car and caused a lot of damage. I mean, when I got out there, I didn't know it was his car, but there was a car that had the windshield had been completely smashed.
Oh.
And he was pissed about that, and I would be pissed about that if it happened to me. Anyway, so that's what I walked into in the Republican Party. The following year, we elected not Phil Wright, who I think would have been the right guy for the job. We elected Derek Brown, who was a nice guy, who handed out Arthur Anderson's book, the one about being nice to everybody.
Oh.
At his first SEC meeting, he bought, out of his own pocket, he bought hundreds of those.
Yes, because everyone around here wants to be nice rather than do the right
and
thing.
And handed him out. Arthur Brooks, is that what I said? That's the author. So
Yeah.
it's a good book. It seemed really gaslighty in the anyway, but whatever. So he gets in there and the conflict is still happening, and the amount of people. So the other side had really campaigned to replace the Gang of 51 people, and in a lot of the more populous counties they had succeeded. But the first several meetings, in fact, the entire time during Derek Brown's term, every SEC meeting, that vote came up again to repeal that bylaw change. But Derek said, look, if you keep it, I will send it to the state properly. And he did.
Oh, good.
But the state wouldn't enforce it. And neither would he.
Well, then it doesn't actually have, it might be recorded at the state level, they're allowed to kick somebody out. But if you don't actually kick somebody out, and there shouldn't have been a process to do it. It should be you turn in signatures, you're just automatically removed.
Yeah,
but the state wouldn't take them off the rolls.
The state wouldn't do it. Yep. So we went through the entire term of Derek Brown, and COVID happened during Derek Brown, and we were having virtual conventions, and the SEC was like, we don't know what to do, but the party still needs to operate. We're going to give you all the authority to make all the decisions if we can't have a meeting. So because he had all the authority, there wasn't a whole lot of incentive to have the meetings.
To be fair, the reason the state wasn't going to enforce, they just automatically kick somebody off the rules, is because the person in charge of the office that would enforce it, Spencer Cox, Lieutenant Governor's office, would then have to kick himself
He was
off the
one
rolls.
of the biggest advocates of that law.
Right, so he refused to enforce the party rules so that he could break them and become governor.
That's exactly what
That's exactly how corrupt your current governor of the state of Utah is.
Yep, so that's what happened. So then Carson Jorgensen gets in office, and he's a rancher from Sanpete County. He's a heck of a nice guy.
He's a great guy.
He doesn't seem to have like these rigid principles that he can't articulate, but he seems to have those principles. He just he's not very articulate.
It's a lack of philosophy because you're on a farm.
Yeah.
You can't enunciate them very well, but you have them. You just don't know why.
Yeah. And he got manipulated a lot by the other side because of his naivete, probably. And so the first meeting, they brought again the motion, and it failed to repeal that bylaw. The second meeting, it again failed, but by then he was complaining that he couldn't get a convention venue for the nominating conventions because there was only like 3 in the whole state that were big enough for the Republican Party. And they knew that they had us because the state law had changed the time frames because they had now universal mail-in balloting, and they had the signature gathering, which had to have a longer window than a convention nomination, and then they had to have the caucus night, and then they had to have the caucus night after the session, but the session got moved back, and the elections got moved up because of mail-in ballots, and so you only had 2 weeks, maybe 3 weeks, in a whole year that could work, and you only had 3 venues in the state. And so
you're stuck.
You ended up paying twice as much as you would do if the timelines and everything hadn't changed.
Yeah.
That, again, was all state manipulation, and it locked in the Republican Party into losing more money and to losing the ability for the state central committee to actually sign off on these things, because when you have to have somebody sign off on it, it takes time.
Yes.
And so in the second meeting of Carson Jorgensen, he made the motion that the state central committee delegate to him the authority to unilaterally decide the convention venue and date. The problem that I had with that is over the previous 3 years that I had been in the SEC, the powers of the governing body had basically been whittled down to where that was the only thing we did. The state decided all of the timelines. The state decided all of the nominating procedures. The state decided what they would and wouldn't follow in our code and membership.
Yeah.
But we got to pick the convention venue and time, which wasn't much.
Yeah.
But it was something. And the vote was nearly unanimous. I think there was 3 of us that voted against giving unilateral authority to the chair of basically the last thing that we did. And ever since then, all I've seen is just resolutions. Like, oh, we're going to shame Mitt Romney for his impeachment vote. Or, hey, we're going to be angry about forced vaccinations. Hey, we're going to support Trump. Like, none of them actually have any power because the SEC didn't have its power. After that meeting, I quit.
Yep.
Now, I was on tilt that morning. My favorite employee in the Philippines was being ransomed by a hospital in the Philippines because he had COVID. They wouldn't let him out.
Right.
And they extorted him for that.
Yeah, so you were having other issues, and
I was having a hard
then
day.
this happens.
And then the SEC gave away their last authority to the chairman, who was a good guy, but that was just a bad move. So I quit. I left the party. I thought it's not like they're putting up good candidates anyway, because the election systems have been so manipulated and neutered by legislative fiat that they can't really protect their brand anymore. And it doesn't seem like people even want to fight because they want to look like they're being nice. And so they won't even fight to protect the brand. This just doesn't make any sense to me. I can't be a part of an organization whose reputation is so unprotected.
Yeah, the Republicans chose to just stop caring about a platform, having any way to enforce people living up to their standards, of governance.
Oh, and it got worse. The executive committee, which is like, it's all of the chairman of the subcommittees, it's the 4 elected officers, and then it's the chairman of the, what do you call it, the auxiliaries? Like the Latino
And it's any national.
And then it's
elected
anybody
persons.
with state or national office that's Republican. So you have the
Yeah.
senators, the congressman, the governor, the treasurer, the auditor.
Yeah, so it's
all of
like
those people.
100 people on the executive.
No. It's like 28, 29.
Oh, I thought there were more
30-ish.
subcommittees than
The
that.
problem is that none of those elected people show up 90% of the time, but they count towards what it is allowed to have a quorum. So you had to have like 14 or 15 people just to have a quorum to be able to vote on anything. And only twice in my entire term as the audit committee chairman, that when I sat on that committee, only twice did we have a quorum, and one of them it was only for about 3 minutes because Romney, the senators, the national representatives are allowed to have a representative to stand in for them and vote.
Yeah, they can have
And
proxies.
so Romney had a proxy on the phone, which we had now allowed to try and make it easier. We still couldn't get a quorum. Romney's person called in about 20 minutes late. We had a quorum, and I made a motion to release to the State Central Committee attendance of that meeting and every State Central meeting.
Yeah.
And I had a quorum. It was the first time we'd had a quorum in a year that I'd been in as the audit committee chair.
Yeah.
It passed. There was a lot of protests, but it passed. And I think we only had one quorum the rest of the time I was there. So I wasn't leaving much when I left the Republican Party, except for the voters in the state of Utah.
Right. Because the
But they
SEC had no power, the executive committee did nothing. It was basically all left into the for the party, it was all left into the hands of
the chair who
Carson.
wasn't strong enough. Nobody
Yeah.
is strong enough to take on national and state
all the
powers
apparatus.
without those committees to back them up.
It was our own deep state in the Utah Republican Party.
Yeah. So,
So you left.
so I left, and I didn't feel like I was leaving much. And the challenge is the grassroots, the people that actually matter in the state, not the elected ruling class, like the people that actually work on Saturdays. Like those people had no idea that any of this was going on.
No.
And what they see is on the news that they watch, which they're basically spoon-fed national news only. And some of them listen to like local talk shows and they get some of that. Maybe they watch the local news and they get some of it. They read the newspaper. But for the most part, they watch Shan Hannity, or they were watching Rush Limbaugh, or they were listening to Glenn Beck. And they were getting the national stuff. And at the national level, the Democrats are absolutely crazy.
Yes.
At least from the perspective of Utahns that have traditions.
Yeah, we're into like 2020. Yeah, they're absolutely insane.
And
Like we were having discussions on a
Republicans-
baby born alive. Do we give it
Is
medical care?
Yeah.
Or let it die? Yes.
And the Republicans, oftentimes there are Republicans that say the right things, but then they negotiate from a point of loss anytime it really comes to a fight. But it's the lesser of two evils. You've heard that all the time. Realistically, I almost am to the point where I would prefer a Democrat because at least I know the crazy stuff they're running on, and I don't get a false narrative from them like I do from the Republicans. At least I know what I can fight.
Yeah.
At least I have something that's out in the open that I can fight. Now they're not doing that anymore. There's a lot of gaslighting from their angle. But so they vote Republican, right? Like, do you remember we had that one candidate coming in here? Oh, you might not have been here. I wish I had Tyler or Milt. We had a candidate running for county commissioner. And she came in here and we asked her what her platform was. And she said, I'm Republican. And we're like, okay, that's great. Most of us are, but not all of us. And she's like, I'm pro Second Amendment. I like guns. I have lots of guns. I think we should be able to keep and use guns. We're like, okay, as a county commissioner, how are you going to be able to do that? She's like, well, I don't know. I just like the Second Amendment. I'm like, are you running for Congress? Are you going to make this a sanctuary state? And she's like, I don't know what that means, but if it's possible, yeah, we should. And we did, and she helped with that. And that's laudable. We weren't very nice to her because to us, her depth of understanding was really shallow. She was another one of those farmers that has great principles but couldn't articulate them. And we didn't recognize that, and we were mean to her. She went home and quit. And some of our group,
she needed a little training on what really mattered,
and helped her understand how to articulate the principles that were just second nature to her because she was raised as a cowboy.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So she had the principles, she just didn't know how to say them. What she knew how to say was Republican, Second Amendment, conservative,
Yeah.
right? And that meant a lot to her. It didn't mean a lot to us because we're a bunch of idiots.
She had a little more
We're
depth
bunch
of knowledge.
A-holes, right? Sometimes. Anyway,
Yeah.
so the Republicans in the state, oftentimes, they don't have the articulation either. And I left. I took about 6 months to decide if I really was going to join another party. And I did. I joined the Libertarian Party because I saw that they actually were fighting for what they believed in and they were defending their reputation. And in the lawsuit, that when it went to the Supreme Court, the Libertarian Party, as soon as it hit the Supreme Court, they released a letter to the court supporting the Republican Party's position.
Right, so this is
a
all
competing party.
You haven't named it, but the bill giving the state the right to allow the signatures was SB 54, Senate Bill 54,
Yep.
and the same gang of 51 kind of Republicans, that whole group, ended up suing and ended up with the Supreme Court.
The state central committee sued.
Yes.
The state central committee voted to have the party sue
the
Utah.
state. Yes.
Yeah.
Right.
And
And
then
again, that
Supreme
went to
Court.
the Supreme Court, and
And in the end, the Supreme Court asked the state election office.
I'm sorry, that was whose election office was running the election
Spencer
office?
Cox was running the election office.
Oh, okay.
So they asked the state election office, hey, we have this case. It's about election law in Utah. What is your opinion? Should we hear this case? And it was funny because all along, Governor Herbert and Spencer Cox had both said, look, we're going to let this thing work out in the courts. We want the courts to decide. This isn't on us. We're executors of the law. We're not creators of the law.
Right.
And so we're going to let the courts decide. But then it goes to the Supreme Court, and they dispatch a public letter to the state of Utah election office and say, should we hear this case? And they're like, no, that's a state issue.
Yeah. So that was
And so the Supreme
Spencer
Court-
Cox office saying, no, let me become
And
governor.
so the Supreme Court declines to hear the case. That was over. Dave Bateman came in and paid off all the bills, and the battle was over. And that was about the time Derek Brown took office. Anyway, so
yeah.
the Libertarian Party had supported that effort.
Yeah.
And so when I really decided that the Republican Party wasn't really anything all that valuable for me to lose, there were great people in the party. And the platform of the party is stellar, and I agree with almost all of it, and I love the wording on all of it. But I didn't see how they could actually stand up for it. I didn't see how they could actually defend it or champion it. And some candidates were going to, but they were going to have to do it on their own because the party was unable to support those good candidates until after the primary. And then after the primary, it didn't matter because there wasn't really other good candidates. And so in my internal dialogue, I said to myself, Brad, what if you had a really good conservative candidate in a whole bunch of races, or candidates in a whole bunch of races that were not Looney Tunes like the Democrats have become, but actually good candidates that just want limited government, fiscal responsibility, separation of powers, and you were to run those candidates for office against the Republicans, would that not push the Republicans to push good candidates so that they could compete against other good candidates? Like, competition makes things better.
Yeah.
And so I joined the Libertarian Party with this dream that someday there would be a Libertarian on every ballot across the state.
Right.
And that was fall of 2021 or 2020. It's been that long. Yeah.
Yeah. No, it was the fall of 2021.
Yeah, you're right. It would have been because
Yep, because we created the
We created
Libertarian
the
Party of
party.
Iron County in January of 2022.
right. So I've taken this long game plan, which I see as the successful strategy that happens in all of politics, culture, and maybe even in like science, philosophy. You got to take the long game. You got to do whatever it takes. And you can't be impatient. And I'm generally a patient person. And so for me, it was like, okay, well, we got to recruit libertarians. We have to educate libertarians. We have to make it so that they're not shallow. They can articulate. They can fundraise. They don't look crazy. I realize my beard doesn't help that, but my skill of articulation is above average, at least. My skill of articulation, if compared with something physical, my skill of articulation is similar to my waistline. It's broad.
Yes.
And
There you go.
so I planned on training, I still plan on training, recruiting, educating, and running candidates for Libertarian office. And if the Republicans can compete against them, that's great. That's better for the state.
Yeah.
If they can't, the Libertarians should win.
Yeah.
And I didn't really want to be a candidate myself. Although I have a friend that won't shut up about me running for offices because I've offered it as a last ditch effort if I couldn't find somebody else good. Well, so in 2021, I guess was the year, Mitt Romney was booed at the Republican
state convention.
He was booed hard.
Yes.
And
in 2022, he didn't even bother to show up. Neither did Spencer Cox.
Here's the interesting thing. When Mitt Romney was booed, there was a guy behind me that stood up and turned around, just turned his back to Romney. Didn't boo. He just stood there. And I was like, that is scathing. Imagine if like 20% even of the crowd.
Yeah, rather than boo, they just stand up and turn your back to you.
It would be so much more powerful than booing. It would also be way classier and not as easy to like make them sound like idiots like the press did to the booers. Anyway, and I thought to myself, Republicans recognize Mitt Romney is a bad Republican candidate. And he's up for re-election in 2024.
Yep.
So what I need is to find a good libertarian candidate that can run against Mitt Romney in 2024, because Republicans statewide would know that if Romney's running again, they don't like him. Now they might be willing to put up with his nonsense if
the only other option is the Looney Tune Democrat.
Lefty, yeah.
Right. But if they had a real
And so then I was like, okay, well,
person.
if it's Looney Tune lefty, Romney lefty, and somebody that's relatively conservative that can fundraise a little bit and can articulate kind of well, maybe we could have a shift in the state. Although, really, that would be a shift in the whole nation. I mean, imagine getting a libertarian elected, or even over 20% in a United States Senate race. But that kind of became my goal. All right, was to find somebody, and I have a couple. I mean, I think Phil Lammy could do it. Personally, I think he has the articulation, the capability.
He absolutely has
He has the waistline for it and the hair.
Yeah.
So, anyway, but that was kind of the goal. Well, then all of a sudden, this special election happens with Chris Stewart. His wife's not feeling well. That's an under-exaggeration.
Yes.
His wife is ill.
Yes.
And he wants to spend more time with her because I think it's dire.
Yes.
There's rumors out there that say he's going to run for Senate, but you've just opened up a can of lies if you're saying, well, my wife is horribly ill. You just never win a Senate race by casting a big lie like that. I think those rumors are just idiotic.
Yeah.
His wife
she's probably ill and it's private, and so they're not telling people.
It sucks in D.C. right now. I mean, they're like protesting Supreme Court judges. He probably has to have extra security, even though he's like an Air Force vet. Anyway, he's done.
Yeah.
Right? So there's a special, and it would have been great had he been done a year ago. Because we just had an election.
Yeah.
I mean, that's how Congress works. Every 2 years. Every even number.
It's always election cycle for them.
But whatever, he's resigning middle to end of September. Well, the state of Utah passed a new law. What it used to be when who was the last one that did that? Chaffetz. When Jason Chaffetz resigned to go work at Fox News, they looked at the state law and said, okay, well, the state law says that the party from which the politician comes from, they get to nominate 3, and the governor gets to pick the replacement. Now, that was the system before. Republicans liked it because usually it was a Republican, and they got to squeeze somebody in to be an incumbent without the big campaign expenses and the vetting process. So Republicans still think that was a better plan. They don't like the new plan, and I get that. Pragmatically, it's more difficult for them.
Yeah.
However, I hate it when the government codifies partisanship.
Yeah, that it's the party that owns that seat rather than the people.
The politicians that got elected were the people, yes.
Yeah.
And so there was an election law changed, and at first when I heard about it, I was like, what? They meddled with the election some more, but this meddling is kind of interesting. They said if a national politician, congressman or senator, resigns midterm, they have a special election. The special election will consist of a primary and a general, and one of those two has to fall on the same date as a regularly scheduled primary or general. So if it's an even number year, they just put it either on the primary or general of that. If it's an odd number year, they put it on the municipal elections, primary or general. That way you save at least half the money of a special election.
Yeah.
The governor was given the powers to pick those dates. That gives him a lot of power, but they give him like constraints. Like it has to be 90 days from the announcement to the first of the elections. It has to be at least 6 weeks after that or something like that. Anyway, so Chris Stewart resigns, the governor announces the new one, and there's nobody ready for that. And it's Congressional District 2. Although apparently that doesn't matter. I mean, the front runner in the Republican Party lives outside the district. Boo-hoo.
Yeah.
That apparently was quite common. Lots of
Hillary didn't live in New York when she became their senator. Oh, well.
So, I find myself saying, okay, there's an election. It's a dramatically condensed time frame, which means getting somebody's name out there is going to be hard. But somebody could not have to dedicate 2 years to running for Congress, which is, maybe nice for some people. And a bunch of my friends started encouraging me to run. And so I did. Well, I mean, even lots of my Republican friends. I mean, every time, the last 2 years, every time somebody talks about vacating an office, whether it's leadership of the Republican Party, the state House or Senate, and now Congress, my friends from the Gang of 51 that were upset at me for leaving the party.
Mm-hmm. They try to lure you back with a position.
They think, well, maybe if he could be in a position to make a difference, he would come back in. And I find myself saying, okay, well, if I ran for that office, I'd want to be a libertarian so that I can provide that competition, because I don't really want the position for myself.
Yeah.
I want to make a change, right? I want to make change. I don't care about anything else. I want change. I mean, I'm an egotist. I don't know if what would Ayn Rand call it? Egoist?
Sure.
But I'm not a narcissist.
Yeah.
I mean, not everything's about me.
Yeah.
I want to make the change. If I can make the change so that the Republican Party is competitive, the Democrat Party maybe competes, the Libertarian Party actually gets elected now and again, like that's a great change.
We could have actual ideas about debate actual ideas and principles rather than just the R wins.
And the Republican Party could spend their fundraising money on Republican candidates.
Yes.
Because they can't do that right now because everything happens in the primary.
Mm-hmm.
So I ran for Congress. And my hope and strategy is that the Republicans... As a libertarian, I ran for Congress. I tried to do it in Goldback. We already talked about this.
Yep.
My hope and dream is that the Republican Party will either see that there's a good candidate running and that competition will help them pick a good candidate.
Yes.
And there's two of them that I think would be good candidates.
Yeah.
But if they can't pick a good candidate, I would like to see the competition from the outside actually show them that person is competition.
Right, because you're going to have libertarian next to your name, but you've been on the major fundraiser for the Republican Party, you've been on the state central committee, you've been on the executive committee, if I'm not mistaken, you helped start the Platform of Republicans.
I was one of the founding members of the Platform of
member of the Gang of 51, trying to... The whole thing with the state controlling the party, it's the Republican Party, the Democratic Party, the Libertarian Party, they're not entities of the state. People... While it's politics, they're private organizations, the same way the Boy Scouts of America is, Daughters of the American Revolution, all of those are private organizations.
They're suggesting to their membership who they like.
Exactly. So the fact that by saying Republicans have to follow these patterns to elect people would be like saying, the state coming in and saying you have to choose your Boy Scout leaders, by whatever criteria, right? You've given up control of your private organization to the state. And
you give it up. They took it.
Yeah, they just came in and took it, and the state leadership went, yeah, okay, no problem, because that means I get to stay in my position more. Like, it's so totally corrupt and been played unbelievably well by our current governor and past. Like, it's just, so you've got all of the credentials for what a conservative Republican is, pro-life, Second Amendment, limited government, reducing the tax burden on people, like all of the criteria Republicans say they believe in, you hold it. So even though you're not going to have Republican next to your name, you're just going to say Libertarian, you're the Republican candidate that the people of Utah think of when they think Republican principles.
Probably true. Yep.
So if whoever comes out of the Republican primary is somebody who shares the same principles you have, that's great. They should push forward with that. But if they don't, if they come up with one of these Democrats who's just running as a Republican because the Republican always wins, there's an actual Republican available for the people of this state to vote for.
Well, and there's an actual libertarian. I mean, Ronald Reagan said the heart and soul of republicanism is libertarianism. And I represent that heart and soul in my opinion. But here's the thing. If for me, if it causes the Republican Party to take ownership in their brand, and pick a good candidate, And I think those candidates are probably Bruce Hughes and Jordan Hess.
They still exist.
If they pick one of those two candidates, I think I'm better, but I think those are reasonably good candidates, and I think that the public would see that they're reasonably good candidates, and they wouldn't have to take a risk on somebody with a porcupine for a mascot. If they don't pick a reasonable candidate, they're going to lose to me.
Yeah.
Because there is a viable option that shares their values better than their own candidates. And realistically, I think even better than Greg Hughes and Jordan Hess. I think if you were to apply the Republican Party platform to me and to them, I would get the highest score. The only area where I think I would get argued against that I don't follow the platform is I think that immigration should happen more. I want to make immigration legal again.
Yes. Yeah.
I want to get rid of illegal immigration, but I want easy, responsible, reliable, legal immigration. I think
that's the position I think most Utahns have.
I think so too. The platform is maybe not quite so clear, and definitely Trump's talking points haven't been very clear that way.
No.
I feel like he's used the immigration issue as a scapegoat sometimes. Although still, as much as I would like to sometimes throw out things I don't like about Trump, I've said many times publicly, I think he's probably the best president of my lifetime. I always follow that up.
The bar's so low.
I always follow it up by explaining the bar.
This is the bar.
I don't know. I think Trump did a good job. There's lots of things I disagree with, but I think every president that I know about has done lots of.
I'm a libertarian. I might support him this next time around because I think he's been treated so badly. He might go in and burn it all down, and I'd be okay with that because it's even more corrupt than the state of Utah is, and the state of Utah is terrible.
Agreed. So.
Anyway, that's a good story.
That was the story, the prequel, and the sequel is...
Sequel? Oh yeah, don't him again.
If the Republicans don't pick a good candidate and the Libertarian wins, it's going to change the whole country.
Oh yeah.
Because it will send that message to... In Democrat states, the Libertarians will say, hey, look, Democrats, you got to do better or else we're going to win your votes. And in the Republican states, it's going to do what I'm talking about here in Utah. And it will make in my opinion, it would make the Libertarian Party or other third parties that closely resemble what the people want, it will make them the second party in those states. Because I would argue 40% of the states in these United States of America are basically a one-party state.
Right. New York, very Democrat. California, very Democrat. Utah, very Republican. Oklahoma, very Republican. Yeah, and so those ones, there isn't a second party, and the Libertarians can be that in those 40 or so states where the Republicans have no chance in New York, Massachusetts, the Democrats have no chance in Utah, Oklahoma, Wyoming.
Virginia.
Yeah. Right, yeah.
Yep.
The Libertarians should be that.
Yep, and I think that is the sequel.
Yeah.
And because it's a sequel that isn't released yet, it's just a teaser.
We'll talk more about this, I'm sure.
That's all I got.
That's a lot.
I don't know, did we do it really in shorter time or did we spend a lot?
I think we spent a lot. That's fine. That's fine.
If anybody watched this, I hope you enjoyed it.
Leave us your comments below. Like and share the video.
Good night.
We'll see you next week.